Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Dawn Jeffries, and I'll be moderating this afternoon's President's Town Hall with Virginia Tech President Tim Sands. Again, thank you for joining us. As always, we will be recording this session, so it will be available after we wrap up as well. Throughout the next hour, we're going to focus on graduate education, on research, and on international students as Virginia Tech works toward a return to campus for the fall semester. We are joined by, as I mentioned, President Tim Sands, Provost Cyril Clarke, Vice President and Dean for Graduate Education Karen DePauw, and Interim Vice President for Research and Innovation Don Taylor. Thank you all for joining us and taking part in our conversation. We will cover a number of questions that many of you have submitted today. However, questions that cover topics that were not among those that I mentioned will be considered for a future webinar. For example, we've gotten a lot of questions related to parking specifically that were submitted, but today our focus will be on graduate education, and where that touches on parking we may get to as well. But President Sands, I'd like to start off with you, if we can, and talk about a couple of timely topics first. In the last few weeks, there's been a lot of uncertainty among our international students, many of whom are graduate students, after the federal government enacted and quickly rescinded its plans to keep international students from the US if classes were moved online. Can you share more about Virginia Tech's commitment to international students?
Yeah, thank you, Dawn, and welcome everyone. International students have long been critical to Virginia Tech's global impact and to our role in attracting talent to the US and the Commonwealth of Virginia to energize our economy and to enhance the diversity of lived experiences that make this country special. I just wanted to share a little bit about my experience. My appreciation for the importance of international talent started with my time as a PhD student in the early 1980s. I was the only Californian in my research group, and for part of my experience, I was the only US citizen. My fellow graduate students were from Taiwan, Korea, China, and Brazil, and they went on to be leaders in the early days of the semiconductor industry in Silicon Valley. Later in my career, when I became an academic, 17 of the 25 PhD students for whom I served as principal advisor at a couple of different universities hailed from other countries, including India, South Korea, Russia, China, and Italy. So most of my students were international. The majority stayed in the US and became leaders in science and technology. Without that stream of the world's top talent, the US would not have led the emergence of the semiconductor industry or the tech revolution for that matter. The same can be said of the biomedical space and so many other sectors that are critical to our economy. Even for the minority who return to their countries immediately after earning a degree, they're forever ambassadors for the US, and they create linkages between the US and other nations that are key to establishing global partnerships. So it's truly painful to see that as a country, we are signaling ambivalence at best or rejection at worst toward the global talent that brought us such strength during the post-Sputnik era. At Virginia Tech, we value our international students, faculty, and staff. Our strategic plan, which if you haven't read, you should dive into it, the Virginia Tech Difference, Advancing Beyond Boundaries, commits us to continue to grow and diversify the global talent that is critical to serving the Commonwealth and the world as a major research university. Our international students also add to the richness of the student experience for all Hokies, and for that we are thankful.
Almost forgot to unmute. Thank you, President Sands. Just a little bit of a follow-up to that. You've been part of previous conversations. You and I have certainly spoken about it in other formats similar to this one that have focused on the social justice movement that's currently taking place in our country following the killing of George Floyd. And, that certainly has an impact on the climate on campus. And I'm just wondering, since this addresses both graduate students and undergraduate students, if you might offer anything or have something you might like to add for today's audience to touch on that.
Well, I can add a little perspective. I think our perspective has shifted over the last couple of weeks and months, and in some ways to a more hopeful future, I feel. I think the wave of reckoning and reconciliation that was catalyzed by the murder of George Floyd and several others in recent times presents an imperative to identify and eliminate the institutional systems that perpetuate racism. real structural and sustainable transformation has been underway as a priority, in some ways as one of the top priorities at Virginia Tech for some time. But the intentionality and pace of this transformation must increase. Our students will see changes in representational diversity and the way we tell our story. These commitments were made years ago, and we have momentum. The Black College Institute, SOAR, the Pathways curriculum, and our hiring initiatives are bearing fruit. But what needs to happen now is the active commitment of the majority to the cause of equity. I want to thank our graduate students and the GSA for their involvement and activism. A real change will require the shift of the burden from a few to the many. And I'm optimistic that we are at that turning point, not just at Virginia Tech, but in the Commonwealth of Virginia. We have a special history, 400-year-old history that is at a turning point. And we, I think, as members of the Commonwealth's community, we have an opportunity to change that narrative and send us in a different trajectory for the next 400 years. We're working on that statewide, and we're working on that certainly with Virginia Tech. So stay tuned, get involved. And to those who haven't been actively involved and are maybe passive supporters of the causes of equity, especially around racial injustice, this is the time to be actively involved, not passively involved. And I think if that happens, we will see changes that will be foundational and transformational and sustainable.
President Sands, we are just shy of a month away from the fall semester restarting. Even closer to that, students will be moving in. Can you give us an update on the university's plans, particularly as it relates to the importance of everyone working together in an effort to really keep everyone healthy?
I think this may be surprising to some, but I am fairly confident in Virginia Tech's ability to thrive this semester. It's going to be challenging. I think our plan for the fall is sound. Untold numbers, we haven't added them up, of people and energy and effort has gone into the plan, and it has evolved steadily. Each week we add to it, we adjust it. It's flexible, it's adaptable. We aim to preserve the critical elements of the in-person experience while protecting the health and well-being, not just the physical health, but the mental health as well of our students, faculty, staff, and community. And while I'm incredibly pleased with our testing, tracing, and case management plan and our aggressive efforts to enhance hygiene, you've seen some stories about those recently, and you'll see more. The degree to which we are able to gradually approach a more engaging in-person university experience depends on two factors, only one of which we control. The first is the global suppression of the pandemic through vaccination and effective treatments. We are months, if not years, away from that endpoint. The second, which we do control, is the degree to which we all adhere to public health guidelines: physical distancing, wearing masks, self-quarantining when symptoms arise, and following the guidance of medical and public health experts. This is tough, but we really did it well in Blacksburg last spring. We had about 9,000 of our students who stayed in town through that period of remote education. And it worked. Everybody, I think, cooperated, understood that it is a serious situation, and we got through it quite well. It's tough, no doubt, but I think we can do even better this fall, knowing what we know now about the disease and its spread. We all have to resist the urge to let our guard down, and I'm confident that Hokies can do it.
Thank you, President Sands. And I'll just remind everyone, we have a Ready website you can get to from the homepage, vt.edu. Our Ready website outlines all of the plans for reentry to campus. But in the interim, Provost Clarke, can you share a little bit of insight, not necessarily every detail, but some insight into how the university worked to determine the approach that's outlined there in terms of the class schedule? I realize, again, it's a lot of detail we can't get into here, but if you can just talk about how you balance what President Sands just mentioned, that desire for in-person versus rather in-person and doing things remotely, and the balance that you have to work through.
Thank you. Yes, I'd be pleased to. So as President Sands indicated, when we started off, we realized that the overall challenge here was to address three interconnected expectations or factors. And those really related to public health, the quality of the academic program, and resource capacity. And simply put, in terms of public health, that to have a successful fall, we need to be committed to mitigating the risk of really COVID-19 continuing to spread with serious consequences, especially for those individuals who are vulnerable. So that was the first factor, and connected in turn with the second, which really has to do with our institution, our university's commitment to deliver a top quality academic program. Now, I'm very complimentary and very appreciative of the remarkable conversion that faculty and our students made this last spring in going from essentially a in-person experience to fully online, and doing so over a matter of just, practically speaking, about 10 days. And while that was a huge accomplishment, it was a challenging accomplishment because our curriculum, our academic program, is very committed to the hands-on, minds-on, what we call experiential learning. That kind of learning that happens when students are placed in an immediate context in which they are, or with which they are engaged, that is compelling, that is relevant to their particular aspirations and interests. And given that particular expectation, while that can be accomplished in many cases in an online platform, it's not possible across the full domain of the curriculum, such as those wet labs, the field experiences, those creative performances, the research, particularly in regards to graduate education. And so in terms of delivering a quality educational program, we needed to focus on maximizing experiential learning, acknowledging that to accomplish that, part of the curriculum, in terms of this goal, really needs to involve an on-campus, in-person experience. Well, so the focus on public health, interconnected with this commitment to a quality academic program, there's a third factor that is connected to each of those first two, and that is that we need to acknowledge that we have certain limits to our resource capacity. And so what I'm referring to here is the capacity in terms of faculty and staff and graduate student time, a capacity in terms of instructional space, their budgetary and financial issues, their scheduling time. All of this really engages or involves a set of boundaries, actually, within which we need to understand and acknowledge as we optimize this relationship between public health, academic program quality, and then taking into account resource capacity. So how do we do that? Well, as I think everyone appreciates, the academic program of a university such as ours is delivered by faculty with the active involvement and support of graduate students and staff. And so faculty needed to be at the center of this discussion in terms of designing each course and optimizing those three factors and making decisions as to whether the course will be fully online, whether it be completely in person, or whether it be a hybrid, mostly online, but then using in-person experiences really to offer that experiential learning that is so important to Virginia Tech. And faculty then working with department heads have done an absolutely extraordinary job. They've done exceptionally well here. And the outcome of that is that now we have a design in place, and students can look more closely at their plan of study now and identify exactly how each course in which they will be, each course that they'll be taking, how each course is going to be delivered. As we work through this process, of course, faculty and department heads had to work with the registrar in understanding what instructional spaces were available. And this was really important because spaces that previously accommodated 150 students, now under expectations of social distancing and of course the use of face masks too, may only be able to accommodate a fraction of the original occupancy level. So as we move forward, our original goal was that we had a stretch goal of having 30% of that experience in person. And as I said, I think we've done exceptionally well. Everything is not finalized because there are some adjustments that have to be made within a flexible system that's necessary here. But in terms of the graduate educational experience, somewhere around a little less than 45% of the instructional experience across the curriculum now will be fully online. And then somewhere a little over 30% will be hybrid, that online format with the experiential learning folded in an in-person format with the balance then being in person. And as we speak about those experiential in-person pieces of the curriculum, of course, when we talk about graduate students, we have to recognize that the direct involvement in research and those creative activities around our artistic expressions and design and so on are absolutely core to our curriculum. And we're committed to providing those kinds of experiences for graduate students. Thank you.
Thank you. And we'll touch on many of those topics more specifically, take a deeper dive into that. But in the interim, Dean DePauw, I just wanted to ask you, I know that you are very in tune with graduate students. You do a lot of Zoom meetings with them, connecting with them. You're very active on social media. Can you tell me what the most pressing concerns are, some of the things that they're sharing with you?
Sure, I'm delighted to do that. First, I want to say, I just want to thank President Sands and my colleagues for, and you, Dawn, for taking the time to make sure that we cover this very important topic of graduate education. And I want to acknowledge that our graduate students that are, I'm assuming, on this event now are around the Commonwealth for sure. Obviously here in Blacksburg, Roanoke, and our locations in the Northern Virginia area, but just to acknowledge that they are here and to make sure that if we hopefully will answer all of their questions. So you asked about the pressing concerns, and I think I have 8 of them that I have listed here. And I know that we will probably get to some of them and maybe not the others, but I think one of the primary concerns that they have and that I share with them as well is our graduate students have a dual role, as I'm calling it. They are graduate students, of course, but they are also graduate assistants, GTAs, GRAs, and GAs. And so there is not a simple answer to the needs of grad students because it depends on the role that they are, the service that they are providing. A second pressing concern is for us in the leadership to understand the differences, the variations in who they are as part-time students, full-time students, masters, professionally oriented in Roanoke, in the Northern Virginia area, some with families. And so it's really a very different, they are very heterogeneous. And that we need to think about that. So I know that's a concern. The third one that I would name is health and safety, not only of themselves, but their families and their students, however they will engage with them. So health and safety, and I know I'm sure there are some questions about that. Also, mental health issues and access to those services. And while I'm thinking about it, let me just share that in the fall, in fact, it's already available now. The Cook Counseling Center is embedding a full-time counselor in the Graduate Life Center that will be available daily during the week, and I think that will help. A fifth concern is, and these may not be in their priority order, they're in the order that I was identifying them. The fifth one is really around financial resources. Part of that is assistantships, part of it is related to tuition and fees, mostly on the fees side of it, and the uncertainty in some of their minds of whether or not the assistantships will continue if their degrees are delayed and they need to have the continuation of financial support. And so that's the next concern is the delays that they have already experienced because of COVID, and how we can help them either re-envision their research or continue with it. And I know we'll talk later about access to research labs and field studies, et cetera. So that's a concern. A seventh concern is really around international students and the impact of the regulations, and obviously the guidelines were rescinded, but there's still some concerns there. And the COVID pandemic had a different impact upon international students. And the latest concern apparently there's been a few questions already is parking. And I am not able to answer any of those, but those are the 8 that I would suggest as being the primary pressing concerns.
Thank you. And we will get to a number of those. And I will say, since you just mentioned parking, I know that Dr. Dwayne Pinkney is the one that really navigates through all of that. And so, we can work on getting those questions answered in a future webinar as well. But Dean DePauw, I'm going to come right back to you, but I wanted to bring Don Taylor in as well. And Dr. Taylor, if I can just ask you a quick question, then I want to go back to talk about many of the unique circumstances. Dean DePauw touched on a few, but for now, Dr. Taylor, can you give us an overview of how the university's research has fared during this pandemic? What impact has it had?
Sure. Well, all in all, I would say we've done exceptionally well. I think we were up quite a bit for the year at the end of the third quarter in our fiscal year at the end of March. And we've actually been able to maintain some growth this year in spite of the fact that we had a pretty tough April. We had we were particularly hard hit in human subjects research, where we had to stop most of that. And some of our soft money researchers were actually had to have their positions put on hold for a while. So we did have a few layoffs. We're now coming back to work on those human subjects research opportunities. I think we actually did finish up, like I said, a little bit ahead. Fortunately, we had a strategy to put a small part of our research portfolio into high risk, high reward activity. And we had a number of very large grants that enabled us to do well. We're also up a bit, or actually quite a bit, again, at record levels in terms of the new research money that we brought in for coming years. And so hopefully that work will translate into something that'll enable us to have a good long-term run as well. So I think one issue that we might want to think about is that we probably have not yet felt the full impact of COVID-19. We were able to continue to pay our researchers and keep the work going to a certain extent, but now we're going to wind up in a situation in which we're going to have some no-cost extensions and figure out ways to fund the work that was missed at the department or college level in many cases. So I guess in summary, we've done very, very well, exceptionally well, you might say, in terms of being able to finish with a record year of research, but we have not yet felt all the effects.
Thank you. At least we have that nugget of good news in all of this. Dean DePauw, wanted to go back to one of the 8 points that you raised in talking about research, particularly lost time for research for graduate students, particularly those related to human subjects, given the disruption from COVID. Can you talk about what options that students who find themselves in that position, what they might have, the support that you're working on to help them?
Yes, a couple of thoughts here is that indeed, many of the grad students were not able to continue their research, especially those with human participants, in the spring. And I think the faculty and the grad students did a fine job under the circumstances of continuing a different aspect of their research, like maybe diving into the literature and writing up some of the methodology or the theoretical background for it because they couldn't get in the lab. So one of the ways that it was adjusted is to look at the whole of the research and what pieces they could work on from doing teleworking until they could get back into the lab. I think I've asked the faculty and the graduate program directors to work closely with the grad students to look at their research, their scholarship, whatever form it is, artistic expression, architecture, et cetera, to see how they can set the time frame for getting pieces of it done that can be done teleworking or need to be on campus. It is the human participants research that has been most challenging. And I know that Lisa Lee in the Office of Research and Innovation has been working with some of the guidelines and Dr. Taylor to help the students pursue their research and do it in a very safe manner. We also have some other challenges related to the delays in their scholarship. And this is for research-based master's and PhD programs and EDD programs, is the internship, required internships and practicum, because where that involves humans and cannot be done through Zoom, there has to be some, or virtual means, there has to be some kind of modification and adaptations. So I know that there's a number of ways that individual faculty members and students are considering their options. We don't have a template that says this is what can happen, but I can assure all of the grad students and the faculty that the grad school is here to help work through those issues and re-envisioning a research project or how it will come to completion, so that we hope to minimize the delays in the completion of their degrees.
I wanted to stick with how.
Dawn, if I could perhaps just add a comment here, and I want to really reinforce what Dean DePauw has indicated here in terms of the nature of graduate programs and the diversity of experience and expectations. You know, graduate education is structured in a manner that's quite different from that of undergraduate. And it's different in the sense that while the university as an entire entity takes a lot of accountability and responsibility for many, many functions, in contrast to the undergraduate experience, the graduate student really belongs primarily within a particular graduate program, which is organized either at the departmental or the college level. And the most important relationship that happens in that educational program is the mentorship, one that exists between the graduate student and the professor. And so as graduate students go forward in acknowledgement of these many challenges, I want to encourage them really to have those candid and direct conversations with their advisors to explain what some of the challenges and expectations are, to see if they can work out a solution that may not be framed in an existing policy, but may be a sensible one. And in those instances when the solution is one where an advisor is not certain that the university would be tolerant or would approve it, then let's have a conversation within the graduate school and as necessary with the provost's office. So in many circumstances, that conversation starts at that graduate student professor mentorship level and then engages the department, the college, and the graduate school, and if necessary, in terms of a broader policy framework, the provost's office.
Don, if I could jump in, and yes, thank you, Provost Clarke. I want to also talk about the grad students as GTAs, and very, very important in their multiple roles. And being a GTA is part of their education, and it's part of their experience. And it is, I've been very pleased to be a part of a teaching and learning group of faculty and TLOS and CIRTL and the Academy for GTA Excellence and grad students, where the concern for fall 2020 and how the courses are going to be taught has been a partnership with grad students who serve as GTAs as well as with faculty. And so when we talk about, we're starting to change some of the, the language where we don't just talk about faculty teaching, but we talk about instructors. And when we do say faculty, we are really implying graduate students who are serving in a variety of roles in the teaching. I would set this up as being a model for what we need to be doing in the future, where we really have graduate student voices at the table in the conversations about teaching, the research, the engagement, et cetera. I didn't want to lose that thought while I was having it. So thanks.
Thank you, Dean DePauw. And I wanted to get back to something else you were talking about earlier, the differences in who graduate students are, because basically they wear many different hats. And I wanted to make sure that the students that are watching are aware of the available resources for them to help them as we navigate through this. You mentioned earlier, again, since they have many unique circumstances, they're working professionals, they have children in many cases, things that could help accommodate graduate students. You mentioned earlier the Cook Counseling Center, having a counselor embedded as we head into the fall at different times. Can you touch on some other resources that are helping to accommodate in this situation?
Sure. I think we have resources that exist within the Division of Student Affairs, and that's Cook Counseling and career counseling is in a different office, but those services that are available to our undergraduate students here in Blacksburg are also available to our graduate students. In addition, we have a graduate school operation in the Northern Virginia Center. I have an associate dean there and director of the Northern Virginia Center, and we have student services and programs that are offered in the greater Washington, D.C. area. Roanoke is close enough, but sometimes too far for the services, because those students there can take advantage of some of the things that we offer 45 minutes away. But we're also working, I'm working with Frank Shushock and others to make sure that we have those services provided there, or at least the availability of them. We need to hear more from those graduate students, and we're beginning that conversation so that we can better serve them. But I guess in general, I am talking now more about the student services, but we have extended some deadlines where having greater flexibility in some of these exceptions that we would need to make to help, that we want to make to help the graduate students be successful. I hope that answers that question.
Yes, thank you. I know that we spoke earlier about research graduate students lost time in doing, particularly as it pertained to human subjects, but I wanted to bring up and ask President Sands and Dr. Taylor if you'd like to offer some input as well, to focus a little bit on the research that graduate students are highly involved in as well, that has been able to continue in this COVID environment, and some examples perhaps of the work that has been taking place.
And maybe I could start off and then turn it over to Dr. Taylor. I just wanted to remark on a few of the programs that have really begun and leveraged the expertise of the grad students, the faculty, and staff to address the pandemic itself. And I'll just call out a few people. Can't call out everybody, but I think Lindsay Mars, Dr. Mars' work on aerosol science, which she was a world's expert in that before the pandemic, but it turns out that she and her graduate students and research group have been critical to explaining the airborne transmission of the virus worldwide. And We just read about William Ducker's work to develop a surface coating that inactivates the virus, and grad students are involved in that too. The work of Mike Friedlander, Carla Finkelstein, Harry Sondheimer, and several of our other distinguished faculty and their colleagues, grad students, postdocs, and staff members to provide large-scale testing to help the region. We have a world-class analysis lab in Roanoke that is really key and centerpiece of our reopening strategy that has been serving the Commonwealth of Virginia through the Virginia Department of Health and through the local health districts to address issues of outbreaks and congregate settings over the last several months, and is available to help us support in the fall of the successful opening of Virginia Tech, and will continue to hopefully support the community as well. So I could go on, but there are a number of programs that just came up organically because of the passion and the call to service that our faculty, grad students, and staff felt, and they realized their expertise could be directly relevant. And I think we're all very proud of those efforts. But I would maybe turn it over to Don, because he's been organizing through the Office of Research and Innovation some programs that are encouraging groups to come together to address the pandemic in the short term and the long term. So Don, do you want to say a little bit about what's been going on through your office?
Sure. And I think Provost Clarke often speaks about how impressed he has been that the faculty pivoted so quickly to online teaching. And in a similar sort of way, I'd like to say that I'm really impressed with how quickly the faculty and our graduate students have been able to pivot to different forms of research to keep the essential operations up and going while we're dealing with the pandemic. So certainly we did have a list of things that we considered essential that did continue throughout the pandemic, even in the early stages. And now we're opening up in a very prudent but deliberate way most of our labs. And I think we've been able to continue not only the research that we normally would have done, but as President Sands has said, we pivoted also to attack the problem directly. And I think in a very ut prosum sort of way, our faculty very quickly rose to the challenge of dealing with the pandemic, and from everything from 3D printing of personal protective equipment to the conversion of a BiPAP machine to a medical ventilator. We then, through my office and working with the institute directors, we pulled together seed funding so that we could try to have an internal competition for grants that would enable our researchers to pull together preliminary work that would enable them to go get external research grants. So we actually had a bit of money that we pulled together, actually a good bit of money, close to $500,000 that we turned into 9 on-campus seed grants. And for that funding, just to show you the breadth of the response that we had almost 100 research teams apply for those grants to award 9. So actually, you could say that the success rate of our seed funding grant internally was about what you might have at some of our external granting agencies. It's very, very competitive. And those, I think another thing I'd like to just back up and say is that Virginia Tech has a very broad research portfolio, which enables us to attack something like a pandemic in a transdisciplinary way that very few universities could do. So we have had through our destination areas recently, I guess, a great emphasis on transdisciplinary work. And we've been able to address everything from, how aerosols move in through the air to, things like how a community reacts to a pandemic, or how a child with ADHD might react to, not being in school for a while. So we've also had, I think at this point, 11 external grants already that are very closely tied to the COVID epidemic. And I think, we've also, our graduate students working with their advisors very closely have found ways to shift the work that's either related or unrelated to the pandemic in ways that enable them to continue their work. So if you can't be in the lab, you can do something like a literature review, or you can maybe pivot to a different kind of work for some period of time. So the flexibility that our faculty, staff, and students have shown has been extraordinary. And I think also the ability to come together and work as teams in transdisciplinary ways has been astounding to watch.
If I could maybe add, just thank you, Don, a little bit of future perspective. Virginia Tech has been actively involved in conversations in the last couple of months about the post-pandemic next normal, if you will, both nationally and within the Commonwealth. There's a lot of opportunity, a lot of need for Virginia Tech to address some of these long-term issues. The one that our provost is most particularly qualified to speak about, and maybe I'll let him say a little more, is this application of One Health, which spans our destination areas, our colleges, especially connecting veterinary sciences, human health, and all of our science and technology areas, as well as the social sciences, is going to be elevated. There's no question about that, especially since COVID-19 is a zoonotic spillover disease, and we have a lot of expertise in that here at Virginia Tech. We are really well positioned to contribute not only to the local environment here and preventing the next pandemic and improving our response to, but really at a global scale. There are other areas where I think there's obviously going to be some big moves in terms of research that graduate students may get involved in while they're at Virginia Tech, or maybe in their future careers, around reinforcing the supply chain, agile manufacturing, certainly biomedical research in general, human health. I mean, it goes on. And I think we are particularly well positioned at Virginia Tech to take a long-term view of what we have learned from the pandemic, not just COVID-19 and similar zoonotic diseases, but also the how do we deal with a disaster in our response. So I think that the Global System Science Group, the work that's going on, as I mentioned, across One Health, across our health science and technology enterprise, through engineering, science, our statistics and epidemiological expertise, a public health program at Virginia Tech that was growing before the pandemic. I'm pretty excited about the kind of positive impact we can have at the highest level, exhibiting with ProSim at a global scale in the future. Not that I would ever wish for a pandemic, but I think that we are particularly well positioned for being a positive actor in our recovery and in the rebuilding of a very different economy for the Commonwealth of Virginia and for the country.
Thank you, President Sands. And Dr. Taylor, I just wanted to thank you for touching on the flexibility in terms of plans of study with students, because one of the questions that came in was from a student who was concerned about missing out on specific learning opportunities. But I think your comments about the flexibility in that is helpful and responding to that. Provost Clarke, I wanted to ask you, very early on this afternoon, you touched on experiential learning and talking about how that played into the plans and the work that went into planning for the fall semester. Can you give us a little more detail about how possible it will be for Virginia Tech to maintain experiential learning? Because we know, as you've mentioned, that it's very much a part of the Virginia Tech experience.
Yes, thank you. I always appreciate the opportunity to talk about experiential learning. So as given my profession as a veterinarian, I'm reminded and I know that much of my learning process and training happened not necessarily in the classroom listening to a professor, although some of that did happen, but it was mostly around the animal patient and engaging directly in that particular health problem. And so if we were to talk specifically about graduate students, we have a variety of different types of graduate programs. As Dean DePauw mentioned earlier on, we have sort of research focused, particularly in the STEM areas around PhD and master's programs. We've got professional degree programs such as the MD and the DVM. And then we have other kinds of programs that really are embedded in the arts and the humanities and in design, where where it's less about the scientific method and more about the creative process. And, it doesn't really matter whether you're in the research-based or the professional or the area of design and creativity. We all as adults learn by being directly engaged with that activity that excites our passion and that is connected often with what we would want to do for the rest of our careers. And so that's how we learn. And so for us to really conceive, for example, of a PhD program in biomedical sciences that doesn't involve direct engagement in research would be dismissive of the way people learn about research. And so in graduate education programs as we go forward, it is an imperative in terms of the educational quality that we maximize experiential learning. Now, what I want to stress, however, is that experiential learning doesn't necessarily have to be literally, physically hands-on. So in many cases, experiential learning can occur in an online format, where that student is engaged with a professor, where the professor has the opportunity usually to work around a case or a problem and to think in really transparent ways, in such ways that the professor can model the thought behaviors that are appropriate for that particular disciplinary interest. And that can happen in an online format. In some instances, it happens easily because we have faculty already experienced in that area. And in other areas, we're going to learn how to do that better. But there are other areas where it's really difficult, where you need to do this in person. So at this point in time, we have to acknowledge that every in-person experience has to be conducted with this commitment to mitigate the health risk that is associated with coronavirus, and to do so in such a manner that we do our best to protect the vulnerable individuals, those who, by virtue of a variety of factors, such as their age or underlying conditions, blood type, whatever it may be, are more likely not just to get infected, but to get seriously infected and get seriously ill. And so as we go forward in our design of those learning experiences, we are being very specific in thinking about the particular circumstance that involves the student, whether that student be the learner or in fact the instructor. And as we design those experiences, the university now has provided an overall framework of expectations around what the guidelines are in terms of the application of public health measures. And then we've provided a system whereby more specific and detailed questions can be addressed by working through our very effective and efficient emergency management team, which is connected with health districts and with a whole stable of expertise at the university level in terms of addressing specific issues.
Thank you. And I'm glad that you touched on that, the work to protect each other. And I'll ask you if you have something else to add to that, Provost Clarke, and perhaps Dean DePauw, because a number of students are concerned about safety and whether their peers will wear masks and things like that. And I'm just wondering if you can touch more on the commitment to doing our part as individuals and as a community, and also just taking care of each other and our mental health. And
so I very much appreciate that question, because it gives me the opportunity to talk a little bit about this incredible community in which we live and work. And the Virginia Tech community is, of course, committed to serving communities, both our own and others. But it's committed to this basic element that I think acknowledges that the way forward is for us to care about the community, to in so many different contexts of our work and our life at the university level, to place the interest of others above ourselves. And so many of us, those who are participating certainly in this town hall, but across the ranks of our faculty and staff and students and administrative leaders, have worked very hard at this now for months in establishing an overall framework, a set of principles that lays out and describes what that commitment is. And you'll see this documented in various ways, and we would hope to enshrine that in a sense through a community wellness commitment in the near future. But beyond that, we've also gone down to some of the details in terms of really describing what those expectations are for things such as social distancing, such as wearing a mask, such as sanitizing, cleaning classrooms, being honest about whether you're feeling ill or not, developing, investing, and sort of standing up and implementing a testing system that is actually remarkable. And so, you know, across this full range of this overall commitment of principles to the guidelines that are established at the university level, to the design of the particular behaviors and practices that are specific to not only a course, but an in-person experience within a course. That has been the work of this community, especially faculty, for months now. And we'll continue that right up to the start of the fall, and we'll continue beyond that because we expect conditions to change on a constant basis, so we need to be very responsive.
Dean DePauw, I know this was one of the topics that you mentioned as well. Would you like to add any
Sure.
additional comments?
Just a couple of things, because I hear daily from grad students about their concern for health and safety. One thing I want to mention is that in the labs, the research environments, mostly labs, there are going to be agreements, have to be, in terms of, in order to open up and open up the research. And I think all the grad students and the faculty members will be in that space, determining the health and safety and how they are going to negotiate that by different times when students would come in, grad students would come in, or if there are undergrads going to be in the lab, how they would not only social distance, where physical distance, not social distance, physical distance, wear the masks and do the other kinds of protections. A lot of concerns from the GTAs, the grad students, have been around that, the teaching environment and what happens if an undergraduate student is not wearing a mask or somebody is violating it. The grad students want to know that their views, as well as the faculty, will be respected and have guidelines. And Provost Clarke was just talking about some of those. So we're doing the best, and the grad students should feel as if they can express those concerns and be respected for their views as well in the teaching and in the research environment. Another related health and safety is whether or not the grad student is going to be respected for their choice not to come on campus, and not just the expectation that the grad student would come in, but that needs to be negotiated between the supervisor, the graduate program director, and the student, because there may be some times when a grad student is comfortable coming back onto campus with all the protections. And then there's other times where they aren't. And so I know they have said to me, they don't want to be expected to be the one to come in, but they want to be respected for their health and well-being and making the choices about themselves as students and as assistantships or on assistantships.
Well, if I could perhaps add a comment there and just reinforce and endorse what Dean DePauw has just indicated here. As I mentioned earlier, when it comes to the specific design of courses and how best to deliver those in terms of optimizing the public health, the academic quality, and the resource capacity factors, faculty, of course, do have primary responsibility and accountability here. But when it comes to issues such as mitigating health safety risk, there's no hierarchy in terms of whether you're a graduate student, whether you're a faculty member, or whether you're a staff member here. Each individual in this community occupies the same elevated position in terms of being encouraged to engage in a conversation as to whether they feel secure or not, and to have a conversation about the public health guidelines that are being implemented in a particular circumstance. And we would hope that in most cases, the conversations that happen between graduate students and faculty, and as appropriate, facilitated by department heads, chairs would have a favorable outcome. We acknowledge that there may be some instances when that is not possible. And certainly in those, they can be elevated and they can engage broader realms of the university to try and sort out a solution here. In some instances, it may have to do with the availability of an appropriate space, where an existing space may not be ideally suited, for example, to the physical distancing that is so important. In that case, obviously, my office would want to be involved, particularly the registrar, because that's where a lot of the estimations and the management happens in terms of the allocation or the assignment of space. But I just want to go back to this point that when it comes to public health issues and concerns about individual risk, there's no hierarchy within our university. We all occupy the same elevated and distinctive position there. And we want people to engage and have conversations so that they can feel comfortable being part of this university's mission.
Thank you, Provost Clarke and Dean DePauw. And I just wanted to give a little plug for the Virginia Tech webpage, which we have, Dean DePauw, you were talking about faculty working together and making spaces, and Provost Clarke, safe for folks that are coming and doing research, for example. And we've been doing stories showing some of the work behind the scenes that's happening. We have one coming up with lab spaces, just showing how labs are being sort of retrofitted to make the environments safe. President Sands, I guess I just wanted to come back to you, and you are all very optimistic about the fall and returning to campus. And I just wanted to ask you before we go what you're looking forward to most about the return of students to campus.
Well, I think obviously we have significant challenges ahead of us. I'm not going to diminish the severity of the pandemic and the unknowns. We learn something every day that's a little different about the progression of the disease, the spreading of the disease, the symptoms, the treatments. And so it's a dynamic situation. But what I really enjoy is watching our Hokie community respond when they need to respond. This is an amazing community. And I get a lot of comments about, oh, the students won't do what they need to do, or the faculty won't do what they need to do, whatever it may be. I reject that. I've seen Virginia Tech, the Hokie Nation, elements of the community just stand up and address the most challenging situations with so much grace and conviction that I think that's our secret to getting through this fall and on to a point where we have a vaccine and we have effective treatments. We don't know when that's going to occur, but until then, I am confident that the Virginia Tech community will rise to the challenge. And I think it will take all of us. It'll be exhausting. There's no question about that. But I'm looking forward to the takeaways, what we learn about ourselves in terms of the strength of our community and the values that we hold and our commitment to pro-sem. So I wish we didn't have to go through it, but I'm confident that our community will rise up to the challenge.
Thank you, President Sands, and thank you, Provost Clarke, Dean DePauw, and Dr. Taylor for taking all of our questions this afternoon, and for everyone who spent the last hour with us. Please remember that you can find the latest information on the VT Ready website. You can get to that from the homepage, vt.edu, and we will keep an eye out, if you will keep an eye out, for future town halls. Thanks.